my opinion, the best explanation for the historical basis behind the legends of King Arthur is that there are actually two individuals who were accidentally conflated into one legendary figure. So, to put it simply, I believe that the historical basis for the European conquest of King Arthur, where he fought against the Romans, was Androgathius. And the historical basis for the core part of King Arthur, we could say, where he's a war leader active in Britain, fighting against the Anglo-Saxons, and he has all these 6th century contemporaries, well, that was Athrois, son of Myric. And over the centuries, they were eventually accidentally conflated into just the same person based on their similar names. Now you might think, well, it doesn't seem like they have very similar names, but we'll get to that. So let's start with Athrois, son of Myric, because like I said, I believe he is the central core character behind the figure of King Arthur. So Athrois, son of Myric, was a historical figure. He's mentioned in a variety of medieval Welsh and Latin sources. So he appears in, for example, the Book of Llandaff, and he also appears in the earliest genealogical record for the kings of Wales, of medieval Wales. Now, the obvious reason to identify him as King Arthur, I would say, is that he lived in the same place that King Arthur was associated with, and he has a name which can be understood as a variation or corruption of the name Arthur. So let's start with the place. Well, King Arthur is regularly associated with southeast Wales in the medieval sources. For example, in the Lives of the Saints, many of them associate Arthur with southeast Wales or places nearby, but it all seems to be centred on southeast Wales. For example, the Life of St. Illtyd records how the saint in question, Illtyd, he came from Brittany in France, what is modern day France, and he went to King Arthur's court upon arriving in southeast Wales. And then after King Arthur's court, he moved on to the court of a king called Paulentus. Now, Paulentus was a king of Glamorgan, a minor king of Glamorgan. So there's no indication that Illtyd travelled a very long distance from one court to the other. He just leaves Arthur's court and arrives at the court of Paulentus. So the implication is that Arthur was somewhere in that vicinity, somewhere in or near Glamorgan in southeast Wales. Another example is the Life of St. Cadoc. Now, Cadoc, again, was a saint active in southeast Wales, Glamorgan and Gwent, and Arthur actually appears a couple of times in this. So he appears right at the beginning, where Arthur is actually involved in the events that lead up to Cadoc's birth. And then he appears again, apparently decades later. So Arthur must have been quite young when he was involved in those events leading up to Cadoc's birth. So this supports the idea that he actually was based in that area. It wasn't just somewhere that he was, for example, he was campaigning in that area because of some military expedition, but he was evidently very young when that happened at the beginning of the Life of St. Cadoc, because he was still alive decades later when he appears again interacting with an adult Cadoc. So the implication from the Lives of the Saints is that Arthur was active in southeast Wales and also the surrounding area. And this is also supported by Geoffrey of Monmouth, because he places Arthur, or rather he gives Arthur the capital of Caerleon, which is in southeast Wales. And well, you could say, well, that's just because Geoffrey himself was based in southeast Wales. Well, that's true, but Welsh tradition also associates Arthur with Caerleon. So the evidence indicates that really he was associated with that location. And then if we look at the Historia Brittonum, well, in the main text, Arthur appears as a leader of battles, and he fights his 12 battles. Now, the problem with trying to identify Arthur's home base based on the location of those battles is that a military leader could have travelled quite far from his home to fight against the Saxons. And in the Wonders of Britain that's attached to the end of the Historia Brittonum, Arthur appears twice, and in one of them he's engaged in a boar hunt. So again, he could have been travelling. So in all of the Historia Brittonum and the Wonders of Britain attached to the end of it, there's only actually one appearance, or one moment where Arthur appears, where we wouldn't expect him to have been necessarily travelling far from his home. And that's in the description of him killing his son Amer. And that's said to have taken place in Erging, which is just outside southeast Wales, the present-day borders of southeast Wales. So, based on the information in the Historia Brittonum and the Wonders of Britain, you could place him all over Britain because he's shown to have been active in all these battles. But the one location which is most logically the place where he actually lived, because it's not associated with a battle or any other kind of expedition, is Erging. So that's southeast Wales, or near southeast Wales again. Another final point I'll mention about Arthur's location is that there's a very strong tradition in the Welsh texts that Arthur was connected to this site called Gellywig in Cernyw. Now, Cernyw is usually translated Cornwall, but the problem is that Cornwall was not the only place known by that name in medieval times. It's known that there was a location in Gwent called Cernyw. In fact, it may well be that Cernyw was actually another name for Gwent. Now, in Gwent, there's a location which is recorded in medieval times as Gellywig. So, could Gellywig in the Arthurian texts have been this Gellywig in southeast Wales, within the apparent region of Cernyw? Well, it's possible, but there's some quite direct evidence, I would say, in Cilwch and Olwen, which is a Welsh tale written in about 1100, so before Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote, so it doesn't display any influence from Geoffrey of Monmouth. So the argument that Arthur was associated with southeast Wales just because Geoffrey of Monmouth was from there, it doesn't apply. So in this tale, Cilwch and Olwen, Arthur is described as engaging on a boar hunt, which goes all across the south of Wales, from the west towards the east. And then as it's going above Glamorgan, but before it's reached Gwent, Arthur orders his men to push the boar down towards the Severn, because he says that he doesn't want it to enter Cornwall, or rather he actually says Cernyw, but if you look on online translations you'll see the word Cornwall most probably, but he actually says Cernyw. He doesn't want it to get to Gellywig in Cernyw, so he orders his men, as the boar is going from west to east above Glamorgan, he orders his men to push the boar down into the Severn. Now, let's think about that. See, if the Cernyw that Arthur was concerned about was Cornwall, then pushing the boar towards the Severn is actually pushing it closer to the very location that Arthur has said that he doesn't want it to get to. That doesn't make any sense. Now, if we imagine that Gwent was the Cernyw that Arthur was concerned with, then Arthur's actions make all the sense in the world, because the boar was heading towards Gwent. So then Arthur tells his men to stop the boar from reaching Gwent by pushing it down into the Severn. So that makes a lot more sense, whereas it's completely counterintuitive if we interpret Cernyw as being Cornwall. So that, I believe, corroborates all the other pieces of evidence that focus on southeast Wales as the centre of Arthur's activity, his home base, we could say. So that corresponds to Athroes, in that Athroes was a king of southeast Wales. He's explicitly called the King of Gwent in the Book of Llandaf, and he's described as giving land grants in Erging, which indicates that he held power over Erging. And in the Harleian manuscript 3859 from the 10th century, it indicates that he was the king of Glamorgan as well. So it seemed that he held power over the entirety of southeast Wales, Glamorgan, Gwent, and Erging as well. So his kingdom was fairly large, at least as large as the famously powerful kingdom of Gwynedd in northwest Wales. Now, what about the name? Well, his name is Athroes, spelled Athrwys. Now, it's claimed that this is a well-attested name in its own right, and it has nothing to do with Arthur. Now, the first part of that is not true. This isn't a well-attested name, or at least not in this form. What we actually find, if we look at the records, is that This name appears to have been another form for Arthurus, with the th after the r rather than before. So that's Arthwys. Now another variant spelling that we find is Arthurus, with two r's in it, so Arthrwys. These are the variant spellings that we find, and no one knows for sure what the original spelling was. But it's evident that it was fairly close to the name Arthur, when we consider that some of the variants of the name of Arthur that we find is Arthurus, or Arturus, or Artus, and various other variations along those lines. So it's true that it may well be the case that this name Arthurus, or Athros, or Arthurus, or anything like that, may have been originally an independent or distinct name from Arthur. But when we compare the variations, it's very obvious that they are similar enough that they could easily be confused for each other. Now, the idea of someone famous getting their name slightly mixed up in the records, and not just corrupted, but actually swapped for a different existing name, well, that is something that we do see plenty of times in the records. So, for example, Magnus Maximus was a very prominent founding figure in medieval Welsh legend, and he appears, in the earliest text where he appears, his name is correctly Maxim. So that's Maximus with the Latin ending taken off, Maxim. However, in virtually all subsequent appearances, his name has actually been changed into Maxen, which is the Welsh form of Maxentius, a totally different name. And yet it's still the same person, and yet he was a prominent figure, and yet his name has been corrupted into a different but similar name. So that, I believe, may have been what happened in the case of Arthurus. If we can't identify Arthurus as simply a variant spelling of Arthur or a corruption of Arthur, then it may be that the name was similar enough that the scribes who wrote these genealogies just accidentally swapped his name for a very similar but distinct name. So the fact that he ruled in the right place and had a name that can plausibly be interpreted as a corruption somehow of the name Arthur, well, that makes him a very interesting person indeed. But what about the time? You see, that's very important. The chronology of when he ruled, that's another key piece of the puzzle. So traditionally, Athros has been placed in the 6th century, which is the time of Arthur. But more recent scholarship has placed him in the 7th century, although there are still many scholars who agree with placing him in the 6th century. Now, I am one of those who places him in the 6th century. I believe that the evidence very firmly supports a 6th century date over a 7th century date. Now, the 7th century date is primarily based on one entry in the Welsh Annals. So in the Welsh Annals, it records how in the year 775, a figure called Fernvale, son of Aethel, died. Now, Athros, son of Myrig, is known to have had a great-grandson who fits that profile. So Athros' son was Morgan, and then his son was Aethel, and then his son was Fernvale. So it's believed that the Fernvale, son of Aethel, who appears in the Welsh Annals, was the great-grandson of Athros. So if that's the case, then that would mean that Athros cannot have been a figure of the 6th century, but instead he must have lived in the 7th century. Otherwise, we would have to assume a whole sequence of absurdly long generation lengths. But the problem with this argument is that there's simply no guarantee that the Fernvale, son of Aethel, in the Welsh Annals is the same as the Fernvale, son of Aethel, the great-grandson of Athros. You see, as Patrick Sims Williams pointed out in 2019, Fernvale and Aethel were both common names within this dynasty, so it could have been another Fernvale, son of Aethel. In fact, in the Harleian 3859, it shows that several generations after Fernvale, son of Aethel, the great-grandson of Athros, there was another Aethel. And there the list ends, so we don't know what his children were called. But like I said, it was a common name. Fernvale was a common name, so he could easily have had a son called Fernvel, and then that would be another later Fernvel, son of Aethel. So that's the key problem with using that entry in the Welsh Annals for the death of Fernvel, son of Aethel, as the foundation of the chronology of this dynasty, as Patrick Sims-Williams admits it is used as. Whereas there are a lot of other pieces of evidence, a lot of other bits of information that we can use to establish when this dynasty really ruled. So, for example, one of the bishops who was a contemporary of the early members of this dynasty, including Athrois himself, was Odosius. Now, Odosius is explicitly recorded as being the son of a man called Budic, king of Brittany. Now, according to Peter Bartram's A Welsh Classical Dictionary, and other scholars agree with this dating, Budic was born in around about the year 500. So he probably had a son no later than the year 540. Maybe earlier, but probably no later than 540. So if Odosius was the son of Budic, probably born no later than 540, then Odosius's life would have extended from then until probably the early 7th century, assuming he died of old age. And he was active as bishop during a large portion of his life. And he appears as a contemporary of Meirig, Athrois, Morgan, Aethel, and even some of Aethel's sons appear as witnesses to one of the land grants that Odosius presides over, although that might be just a later invention. But anyway, the point is that Athrois was around near the early part of Odosius's career, because Odosius continued as bishop until into the reign of Athrois's grandson. So with that being the case, Athrois must have been a 6th century figure. And the chronology of Odosius is reinforced by the fact that he's explicitly presented in these records as succeeding Bishop Tylo. And Tylo is well established as being a 6th century figure, and that isn't controversial. In fact, Odosius was the nephew of Tylo and directly succeeded him as Bishop of Llandaff. So, based on the information that we are directly presented with, Odosius should have been a 6th to early 7th century bishop, which places Athrois in the 6th century. So that's some explicit information, unambiguous, unlike the entry in the Welsh Annals, which is ambiguous, because we don't actually know for sure which Fernvel, son of Aethel, it was talking about. So that's an ambiguous chronological reference used to serve as a foundation of this chronology, whereas in contrast we have these unambiguous references which surely serve as much better foundations for the chronology. Now, another point worth considering is the fact that there was an earlier bishop called Bishop Dubricius. Now, he served as bishop in the early or the late 5th century to the early 6th century, and again, that's not particularly controversial. That's quite well accepted. So his date of birth is generally placed in sources in around 465. Now, the records about this dynasty in southeast Wales, particularly the dynasty of Urging, make Dubricius the first cousin of a king called Gurgen Fawr, or Gurgen the Great. Now, this Gurgen was the maternal grandfather of Athrois. So, if Gurgen Fawr was the first cousin of Dubricius, then, without any preconceived conclusions, we would imagine them to have been born at around about the same time. And since he was the maternal grandfather of Athrois, we would expect Athrois to have been born 2 generations later, with one of the generations probably being shorter than normal because it was a female generation and women tended to get married and have children earlier than men. So that would place the birth of Athrois in the early 6th century. So, in summary, with Athrois, we have him ruling in the right place, having the right name, arguably, or at least a name which could be interpreted as a corruption of Arthur, and he lived at the right time. So, in my opinion, he can be very firmly identified as being the historical, the real King Arthur. However, he doesn't explain the legends about Arthur going into Europe and conquering large portions of the continent and waging war against the Romans. He doesn't explain any of that. So that's where Androgathius comes in. So I believe that Androgathius was the ancestor of King Arthur, or Athros, son of Myric. Now the reason why I believe that is because Androgathius, like I said earlier, was the son of Myrig, son of Tudrig. Now Tudrig was the son of Teithfelt, son of Teithrin, son of Tathel, son of a person recorded as Anthon, son of Magnus Maximus. Now whether he actually was the son of Magnus Maximus is debatable. He's not recorded as having a son by this name, but in any case he was remembered as being the son of Magnus Maximus, and so we can assume he at the very least succeeded him in some sense. Now Androgathius, I believe, fits the profile of this Anthon, son of Maximus, recorded in the Welsh genealogies. You see, Androgathius historically is known to have been the cavalry commander who led Magnus Maximus's armies. So this occurred in the 4th century, in 383 to 388. That was when Magnus Maximus took over the Western Roman Empire. So he's recorded as being proclaimed emperor in Britain in 383, and then he left Britain with his army, led by Androgathius. In fact, one Roman historian even says that Magnus Maximus left the general direction of the war in the hands of Androgathius. So the army arrived in Gaul, or France, and it met up with the army of Gratian, and then there were some skirmishes, but then most of Gratian's army switched sides, and then Gratian fled, and then Androgathius pursued him, and then killed him personally. Now, essentially the same story, almost identical, is found in the legend of Arthur. Arthur arrives in Gaul with his army. He meets with the Roman ruler of Gaul, and there's not really any notable battle, but most of the Gallic army switches sides and joins Arthur. And then the Roman leader of that territory flees, and then Arthur pursues him and then personally kills him. So the story is identical, apart from details like the names and the exact locations that I mentioned, but the general outline of the story matches so incredibly well. And then this correspondence between the historical activities of Androgathius and the legendary activities of Arthur continue right through to their final battle. In the case of Androgathius, it was at a place called Siscia, or Siscia, in modern Croatia. In the case of Arthur, it was at a place called Siscia, which Welsh tradition places somewhere beyond the Alps, so that would match Croatia. So the whole outline of their careers, or of Arthur's career on the continent and Androgathius' career on the continent, match so incredibly well. And in a book that I wrote back in 2019 called King Arthur, the Man Who Conquered Europe, I outline in great detail, in comprehensive detail, how exactly the activities of Androgathius led to each event in the legend of King Arthur conquering Europe. But let's return to the point about Androgathius being conflated with Athros, son of Myric, or in other words, King Arthur. Now, the name Androgathius at first sight doesn't appear very similar to Arthur at all. But something that we see quite a lot in the medieval Welsh records is we see instances of people being remembered by just the beginning of their name, or in some cases just the end of their name. So in the case of Androgathius, if you take the first part of the name, the A-N-D-R, and we also consider the fact that there are many examples in Welsh texts of a D being exchanged for a T or even a TH, then we could have A-N-T-H-R. And another example of an attested corruption is the letter R and the letter N being swapped for each other. And we see this in the name of a person called Arddun. So that's A-R-D-D-U-N. Now this is actually a female character in the Welsh records, and there's evidence that in one record she appears with her name corrupted into Arthur. So I believe that's what's happened in the case of Androgathius. He was remembered, well, his name is quite complicated anyway, especially to the Welsh. They had nothing like Androgathius in their corpus of names. So I believe that he was remembered with just the first part of his name, and then because of the similarity between that and Arthur, that evolved into Arthur. And as well as evolving into Arthur, it also evolved into Anthon. And so that's where we find Anthon, the son of Magnus Maximus, in the Welsh records. And there are at least two pieces of evidence for believing that Androgathius was the historical figure behind Anthon. So the first is the fact that Androgathius had a Gothic name, and the descendants of, out of the 4 descendants of Anthon, between Anthon and Myrig, out of the 4, 3 of the names are Germanic names, or even Gothic names in particular, which is extremely rare, extremely bizarre in the medieval Welsh records. It's, in fact, I think unheard of to see a sequence of Germanic names in the Welsh dynasties. And yet that's what we find just after Anthon. So I believe that supports the conclusion that Anthon was Androgathius, just with his name shortened and corrupted. And what's especially interesting about this is that Anthon appears elsewhere with the title King of Greece. Now, I think that is very easily explainable in the context of Androgathius' activities. It's true he never really did become the king of Greece. He never really did conquer as far as Greece, but he got quite close. He got as far as Croatia, which is the Balkan Peninsula, and to the medieval Welsh, they may have just simplified that and exaggerated it into Greece. I'm not aware of any evidence in the medieval Welsh records that they really had any awareness of the more intricate geographical layout of that area. I'm not aware of any references to any of the specific countries in that area, but Greece, they definitely knew about. And the area that Androgathius did start conquering into was all part of the same province that Greece was part of, and the capital of that province was in Greece. So I believe that Anthon, being described as the king of Greece, is perfectly understandable if we understand him to be Androgathius. Whereas if we don't make that identification, then it's just inexplicable why Anthon is described as the king of Greece. But the fact he's called the king of Greece is very interesting indeed in terms of King Arthur, because in Cilwch and Olwen, there is a line which most people haven't paid any attention to, that says that Arthur conquered Greece. Now, there's no explanation for that within the context of the 6th century Arthur. So isn't it quite a coincidence that the only other person in medieval Welsh legend who's recorded as being the king of Greece just so happens to have a name so similar to Arthur, that is Anthon, son of Magnus Maximus? I don't think that can be put down to a coincidence. I believe that that's strong evidence that Androgathius, or Anthon, son of Maxim, was incorporated into the legends of King Arthur. So in Cilwch and Olwen, we see that conflation express itself in the form of Arthur being described as conquering Greece, and also other parts of Europe as well in that same passage. Whereas in other legends of King Arthur, like in Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae, we see that conflation manifest itself in terms of the account of Arthur conquering Europe and fighting against the Romans. But in both cases, they're both very easily explainable if we incorporate Androgathius into the mix. If we work on the conclusion that Androgathius was conflated with the later 6th century Arthur, then basically all of the Arthurian legends, Arthur's supposedly larger-than-life career, it all makes a lot of sense.